Chad Hayes, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thanks for having me.
You were first elected to the Illinois House when?
In 2010, or I started to serve at the very end of that year of 2009, or I guess 2010. Served for about 3 or 4 weeks. Representative Bill Black, who I succeeded, had stepped down. So I came into, at the time, what was a rare overtime session called by Governor Quinn. And then I'm in my 4th full term.
And I think you had been a mayor beforehand, and what else had you?
I had served as mayor of my hometown of Catlin, Illinois, which is a small community in Vermilion County, and my professional background is in healthcare administration. So I for the last 15 years, before coming here, I was vice president of Provena United Samaritans Medical Center in Danville, ran their foundation, several of their community outreach programs, some non-clinical areas of the hospital. And previous to that had been an administrator for multi-specialty physician group practices.
You know, one thing that strikes me, and I say this for the viewers somewhat, is a lot of times people on the outside, and we see this both at the federal level and at the state level, people are so divided along partisan lines that it's often the man on the street, so to speak, who's the hyper-partisan, and people in either Congress or the legislature are not as partisan as you might say the civilians. And we should say one of the things you're also famous for is that you're a member of a band. I almost said a rock band. I don't know that it's a rock band. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's a folk band. But a band where you play with Senator Don Harmon, who's a Democrat, as well as some others. So it's and you've used that, I think, to form some very close relationships, and not only through the band, but just in general with people across the aisle. Right?
Yeah, that's been one of the kind of byproducts of being here. I had played guitar in my youth, etc. It was something that I was going to pick back up, probably would not have, and I. As fate would have it, when I first got here, sitting directly in front of me on the floor of the House was Representative Mike Tryon from McHenry County in Crystal Lake. And we started as a fundraiser, one of my fundraisers here in Springfield. He indicated he had played in a Jimmy Buffett cover band before he came to Springfield. So we worked up 4 or 5 Jimmy Buffett songs, played them at my fundraiser. We had fun with that. Then we started playing for charity largely, and then just for fun. And Senator Harmon from Oak Park, Democrat, found out that we were playing. Don plays guitar very well. Asked if he minded if we minded if he sat in. We said sure. And the next thing you know, people started coming out, and the Republicans came out, and the Democrats came out, and it became a lot of fun. Like I said, we have sold T-shirts for charity, largely for veterans causes, and it morphed into. We got invited to play at a wonderful music festival in Danville, and the lineup was like world-renowned kind of a lineup, and they asked us to open the entire festival. So we got we brought in some ringers from Champaign-Urbana, and my sister Carla is a terrific singer and plays keyboards. And the next thing you know, when the current governor was elected, they said the governor-elect wanted to forego kind of the formal black tie kind of a gala in favor of a more accessible concert. And so of all things, we were able to open for Buddy Guy and Toby Keith at the Springfield Convention Center. So it's kind of taken on a life of its own, but it really has. It's been a forum, kind of away from the Capitol. I've become, I've come to know Don Harmon, for example. It's possible you could be here for several years. He's in the Senate. He's, the Senate President Pro Tem. I probably would not have formulated a personal relationship with Senator Harmon had it not been for the music. And I'm told after we got started, they're saying people said, this is kind of how it used to be. You're providing kind of this service where people come together, and it's not at each other's throat, and it's not about ideology, etc. And I never even considered that until I heard it for about the 20th time. And I thought, well, if that's an offshoot of this, well, that's a positive thing from my perspective.
Yeah, and as you say, Senator Harman's from the Chicagoland area, but when he came down to Vermilion County, which is an entirely different part of the world, but it's helpful for people to see the other parts of the state, right?
It is helpful. In fact, Senator Harman has been to Vermilion County on a number of occasions to play. We played at a fundraiser for the Vermilion County Conservation District, for example. He brought his entire family. They spent the weekend in Danville, and he has gotten to meet the mayor and some of the folks in Danville. He's obviously been well received. Former Representative Tryon, we kind of joke. Representative Tryon actually grew up in Terre Haute, Indiana, which is not terribly far from my district, and he's been down many times. We've kind of adopted him as an honorary Vermilion County, and but it's been very, very positive. But I've been able to travel to their areas as well, and one of the challenges for the band is we don't really live very close to each other. My sister lives in Wisconsin, etc. But it comes together, and it's when we have a larger dynamic, sometimes here in Springfield, groups like the fact that the band is fronted by legislators. But like I said, sometimes we bring in some ringers that are pretty good. That makes us look probably better than we are.
Well, I don't want to talk about the band necessarily, but I will say the other night we were at some reception a week or so ago, and it was you guys were just fantastic.
You're very kind, thank you.
In all seriousness, and your sister is really a great singer, and
she's clearly the talent in the Hayes family, and she was the one when we were younger that she was in the bands, and I would get up and make a cameo appearance now and then. So, but it's been fun, and that's really been a treat as well to be able to do this with her.
With that era of good feelings, and as you say, you started off playing at the governor's inaugural. I was in the audience that night. It was quite a interesting evening, to hear, as you say, the different national acts and as well as your own band. But now we have this entirely change of mood, and the reason we wanted to touch base with you to kind of record where are we in this point in time, because it seems to me over the last 4 years since or so 3.5 years since Governor Rauner came into office. We now look in this election cycle, the governor's running for re-election, you're not, and something like 15 House Republicans are leaving the House, which is, you always get some turnover, but this is not usual. And what has happened with the mood? What is behind this mass exodus of Republicans leaving the House? Because I think a number of people, and I presume even yourself, might have wished to have stayed were the conditions different.
Certainly you hit on something that I think is the case. The dynamic is more polarized than it's perhaps ever been, and I think that's perhaps the truth maybe in politics nationally as well. And I don't think it's just the Republican Party. I think this is a situation that's really kind of festering in both parties. You have a situation. I would argue that part of this is brought on by the lack of fair maps or of independent maps. And what I mean by that is, as you know, we have 118 House districts in our state, but there are only a handful that are truly competitive. And when you have these districts that are drawn, that are almost a foregone conclusion, at least which party is going to win, it does lend itself to a situation where people farther and farther on the right and farther on the left can win these seats. And what I mean by that is when the finals or the general election is really a foregone conclusion, you don't really have to have people who appeal much to more moderate elements or to independents or to people who don't really fancy themselves a Republican or a Democrat. You only really have to appeal to kind of those hardcore partisans either on the left or the right. And I think you're seeing a real movement in both parties where in the Republican Party certainly my caucus is certainly indisputably farther to the right today than when I came. And I don't think there's any question the Democrat caucus is indisputably farther to the left than it was when I came here. In fact, I would argue on the Democrat side, in addition to serving longer than any speaker in United States history, maybe even more miraculous than that, is that the speaker, keeps control with a caucus in his own caucus that is increasingly growing significantly farther left than him. The speaker came to power, I would say, in the macro sense, with blue-collar union Democrats. And his caucus looks very little like that at this point in time. People that kind of fancy themselves progressives, that are very, very far to the left of the speaker. And in the Republican Party, you really have this dynamic that's going on nationally as well. I had a person that's been in Congress for a long time tell me recently, he said, a few years ago, this individual said I would have been one of the most conservative members of the United States Congress. He said, now I serve with this new breed of Republican who, if they don't get everything they want, will settle for nothing. And the seasoned veteran said, I just don't understand that. He said, I grew up in an era where if we agree 70% of the time, we are blood brothers in politics. And so you really have people both on the left and the right who are kind of these hardened ideologues. And instead of kind of making the sausage and making the process work, and the power really is in the process. They're willing to kind of stand on the sideline and be forceful about their ideology, which is fine, and I certainly respect that. But at the end of the day, you have to have people who are willing to step forward and govern. You're giving something, I'm giving something. Certainly, I'm not going to check my values at the door, because I would never do that. And I'm somebody, if you talk to people on the other side of the aisle, would say, Chad Hayes will deliver a beatdown on the floor if necessary to protect his area, to protect what he believes in, etc. But he's also somebody who is reasonable, that I can talk to, and I can say, hey, here are the dynamics in my area. Here's how they're different perhaps from your area. Can we work together on this? And I have been somebody who I think would be thought of as somebody who does have an open mind, who is not going to, check in his values and the things that his constituents believe in, but I'm somebody who's willing to govern. And I think that's one of the things going forward as a nation, and certainly as a state, we're going to have to do a better job of asking much tougher questions of candidates. And what I mean by that is it possible to be reelected time after time after time after time as an ideologue on the left or right, probably never passing a bill, never having much influence here in Springfield? It's very possible. But I don't know that lends itself to what we need done in the state of Illinois. We are in a situation economically, the business climate, and the list goes on and on and on and on. To stand pat is really not an option. And, you hear commercials on both sides of candidate A or B or C says, I'm going to go to Springfield and I'm going to turn, we're going to turn loose on Springfield, and here's how it's going to be. And after I get done chuckling, my thought is, well, that's exactly how it works. Why didn't I think of that, right? I've only been here 8 years. And after I start chuckling, but the tougher question is, but that will get you nowhere. So now what are you going to do?
Well, and over the last 3 years, and so I wanted to somewhat talk about the budget process that we had last summer. Well, we were going nowhere, and in many ways we're still going nowhere. Before I get to the budget of last year that passed, I was talking to a fellow who was a former mayor yesterday. And we were talking, and I would argue, looking at the Illinois economy, that what is the cancer of Illinois financially is the property taxes. And we have people across the state are getting taxed out of their homes. Businesses, have an undue burden trying to be competitive with other states just because they pay so much. And we need to address a rewrite of the tax system, because I think what we're doing is unsustainable. And yet, many people would argue, I don't want to make it sound like it's my theory alone, that what we as a state are being held hostage by the egos of two men, Governor Rauner on the Republican side and Speaker Madigan on the Democratic side. That those two individuals, I was told the other evening that when we had the budget fight of last year, and it was the first budget in about 3 years, but it was passed over the veto as people will remember, of Governor Rauner. But I was told even Speaker Madigan didn't really want a budget passed either, because he thought it would be better politically to keep the governor kind of swinging in the wind, so to speak.
Right.
Is that analysis accurate in your mind from what you know? And when we go back, what was going on behind the scenes when we passed a budget, which at least the state didn't go into junk bond status,
Right.
and we've reduced our unpaid bill backlog from 16 billion down to about 8 billion and change?
Right.
I would argue, I mean, we would have been in a whole world of hurt had we not passed that. And I believe you were one that voted for the veto override.
I was. You know, we were in a situation, we hadn't had a budget in, I think, 31 months by the time the override took place. And, you know, there certainly was a standoff. Obviously, the principal players were the governor and the speaker. And the negotiations had been bogged down for a long time. They were clearly going nowhere. There was clearly a lot of personal animosity. And I think the combination of two things happened. There were a group of Republicans who, like myself, were very, very concerned for a lot of reasons. We were not paying our bills. We had run up over $16 billion, billion with a B, of a backlog of bills to people who had provided goods and services to this state that we were certainly not paying. We were stiffing them, I would argue. In addition to that, institutions like, in my case, Dan Valera Community College, pivotal as it relates to not only educating young people, educating people who have been displaced from the workforce, you know, a place they can go to update their skills, but also a very critical and pivotal partner with businesses who are choosing to locate in our area. There's a very close partner with almost all of the new businesses over the last 10 or 15 years between the community college and that business and training and retraining of employees, et cetera. It's absolutely critical. I would argue the crown jewel of my home county. And for an institution of that nature to become a shell of itself is so devastating that I'm not sure I can articulate what that would mean. And so I was in very close communication on a weekly basis with the president of the college and others, and said, this cannot happen. We cannot ask these folks, and it's true at the university level, it's true with social service providers, et cetera. They didn't know what money was coming. They didn't know what the budget was going to be. They didn't know when the money was coming. And so they're really involved in this long time, month after month after month, smoke and mirrors act, trying to, you know, you're on the local school board. Well, how much are we going to get from the state? Well, I have no idea. Right. Well, how many teachers can we retain? I have no idea. And so those kinds of things are not very helpful in our local communities or to our state either. And so I was part of a group on our side of the aisle that said, you know, the powers to be have not been able to get this done. I would argue that I've never worked for any entity in my life that had I been given 31 months to get a task done and did not get it done, they would have fired me. And had they not fired me, I would ask what the hell's wrong with them. Mm-hmm. And so on the other side of the aisle, I think the pressure was growing as it relates to the speaker to get something done
because
as well.
On the Democratic districts, they also had colleges that weren't getting paid
Right.
and schools that weren't getting paid. So
Right.
everyone was feeling pressure.
Right. And
I don't not to, but did you talk to your Democratic colleagues about this? And was there a sense of an uprising on both sides of the aisle?
I think there was, and you know, there are formal conduits getting a budget. Excuse me. There's working groups, and those things were going on, but it had become painfully apparent that those traditional avenues were not bearing fruit. And so the whole thing had morphed into talking points and finger pointing and you know, this, what I call this inside baseball stuff that frankly the electorate's not that interested in.
To what extent was the governor, to what extent were you as representatives, let's say on the Republican side of the aisle, and it would be on you want to represent your districts as you explain, and everyone was feeling the pressure because of no budgets being passed. To what extent were you able to say, hey, I'm going to represent my district and the needs of my district? And to what extent were you being pressured by the Governor Rauner, who didn't want a budget?
Well,
or at least he would argue, I suppose, he didn't want,
right.
He wanted a budget, but he would say on his terms. But I would argue we kind of ran out of time for negotiation when we're coming to the point where, had we not overridden that veto, I think the next day it was pretty clear the bond houses were going to put Illinois in junk bond status.
Yeah, when the original vote was taken, we were literally 12 hours away from the bond houses putting us in junk bond status. To my knowledge, it would have been the first time any state in the history of the United States were in junk bond status. The ripple effect from that are the ramifications are devastating. I told people, in my home district, I said, I was not at all pleased to be put into that kind of a situation. I'm very disappointed to this day that the leaders who were supposed to hammer this out were unable to do it for a prolonged period. With that said, I would argue, the building was on fire, the building being the state of Illinois, and there were two choices, in my humble opinion, as someone who represents a downstate district. I could either grab the fire hose and start spraying water on the fire, or I could pull up a lawn chair and watch the building burn to the ground. The latter perhaps doesn't make one an arsonist, but I would argue it doesn't make one a hero for sure. The other thing that I would say is, there's always a lot of political posturing here for obvious reasons, right? Many bills are filed here for the press clip at home, and many people don't really move off of the talking points. I've been a little different than that since I got here, and I'm way different from that now in that, maybe a part of it is that I'm not running. I now just announce when I'm speaking publicly that I'm on the Unvarnished Truth Tour, and I generally get the response after I get done speaking, wow, I've been to a lot of these kind of things. You told me more about how this really works than anybody's ever told me in my life. And sometimes they're 30-year educators, et cetera. And not in a throwing stones at the other guy kind of a way, but just saying, hey, these are the dynamics that are in play. So finally, on our side of the aisle, the truth of the matter is, in a town where it's hard to keep a secret for 15 seconds, we were meeting privately in my apartment.
And who's we?
The Republicans that had come to the determination that the process had broken down and there was not going to be a budget yet again. We were going to go into junk bond status.
So it was basically an uprising where the individual members were saying, okay, we got to do something.
At least,
we're not going to sit back and have another year with no budget.
And so we met, a group of us, and decided, are we going to insert ourselves into this outside of the traditional pathway? And there was a decision by 10 or 12. I would suggest that the number was as high as 18 at one point in time, and had the speaker called the bill sooner, there were 15 Republican votes on the original bill. Had he called it 3 days earlier, it would have been 18. There were 10 on the override. The reason for that is he did not heed my advice to not have these people go home over the 4th of July weekend, or you will lose votes, and that in fact happened. So on the override, we had 10 votes. We would have had 11. We had one member in Russia on a trip that had been planned for a long, long time, so that would have been the 11th vote. But nevertheless, and what was really interesting at those early meetings, it was pretty clear that the speaker was willing to formulate a budget. He was willing to take into consideration the things that some of the Republican members had to have. But I don't think I think it's very clear that he had no intention of running the bill on an override vote. Because I think his thought process was, well, if we pass the budget and the governor vetoes it and just is able to sit it out, then we provided a budget and the governor has no skin in the game. My calculation from the beginning ended up being the correct calculation, which was if the Republicans bring, in the end, 15 votes onto a budget, that is very difficult in a lot of these Republican districts. And they do it because it had to be done, and they do it because the adults in the room needed to stand up, and they needed to stand up right now, before we go into junk bond status and before this horrible situation gets much, much worse, that the speaker was going to be in no position on his side of the aisle to say that those people have shown courage that in some cases will end their political career, and I'm not going to call the vote on an override. I made the calculation that it would be a meltdown of epic proportions on the Democrat side if he didn't call the bill on the override, and that ended up to be true, because I think there were those on his side of the aisle who are just as passionate that this has to end, and enough is enough, and the childish finger pointing and chest puffing and the rest of it has to end, and we have to move forward. And I think that calculation ended up being the right calculation.
So, when let me preface my own question here, but I'm not looking to make anyone necessarily the boogeyman. I'm trying to find out and record. I think this is a unique period of Illinois history, a bad period, and what's happening? What happened then? Who do we blame? Is it the governor? Is it the speaker? Is it both of them? To what extent is the fact that both of these individuals, the governor and the speaker, control their caucus by controlling the spending for campaign funds, and to what extent does that rob individual members from independence? And is that the case? And if so, what needs to be done to change this equation?
I think we're certainly in a situation now. I think the Democrats have been for some time, where the money flows to them through the speaker. And one of the things I noticed when I first got here is, on the Republican side, traditionally, you raise money locally. Once you get here, there are other sources of money that come in with people, who know that you're supportive of their cause or what have you. And so on the Democrat side, for a long time, members have been on a program that if you knock on doors and you do this and you do that and et cetera, the money will come. And if you don't, sometimes that's problematic for that member on the other side of the aisle. On the Republican side, there's been a lot of personal skin in the game on the fundraising front, right? I raise money. I would probably be on Chad Hayes, is a disciplined and consistent fundraiser. He holds fundraisers in his own district. He holds them in Springfield. He does that kind of thing. Now, the amount of money necessary in a competitive district has changed exponentially since I got here, right? When I got here, if I had $150,000 in my campaign fund, I would be on the good guy list, and he's doing what he should, and frankly had a higher balance in his campaign than my 25-year legendary predecessor, right? Now you have this situation where on our side of the aisle, you have a billionaire governor, and frankly, giving this conversation some context, in the 2014 House races, the House Republican organization spent $6 or $7 million on races statewide. When we picked up 4 seats in 2016, that number was north of $32 million.
Wow.
So that's a pretty dramatic jump. And so for the first time, for sure, in the speaker's tenure, on those close races, generally what happens is the Democrats wash out the Republicans in the competitive races with money, from labor unions or wherever it's coming from. This is the first time that the Republicans washed out the other side in money. And I would argue, probably the most Mike Madigan thing that you've seen in recent history is, him being on a billionaire who has so much money, he makes the current governor look like he grew up on the poor end of town. That happened early, because if you know anything about the speaker, you beat me once with that, but you're not going to beat me twice with it. Mm-hmm. And so people said, well, you surprised that he was on J.B. Pritzker early? Well, I was not at all surprised, because J.B. Pritzker, was a bigger sugar daddy than the current governor was to the Republicans. Right. And so that was an easy choice early. I think that entire discussion, though, has very serious ramifications as it relates to democracy itself. The tactic, since I've been here, have had a tactic employed by both a Democrat and a Republican governor. Governor Quinn, under the auspices of pension reform, and Governor Rauner, under the auspices of the General Assembly, employing his turnaround agenda, said, well, if you don't do it, we're not going to pay the legislature, right? And so
Governor Quinn said that.
Governor Quinn said that and did it for about 4 months.
Right.
Governor Rauner did it and did it for about 10 months. The courts, in both instances, of course, determined that that's blatantly unconstitutional. I would argue not only is it constitutional, I think it rises to the level of extorting another branch of government. I mean, if you are going to allow the executive branch of government, for any reason, to say to another branch of government, I'm willing to harm you financially until you come around to my point of view, I would argue that democracy crumbles immediately. Unfortunately, most of the media outlets applaud this tactic. They say, yeah, you know, if I don't get the job done on my job, I don't get paid, et cetera. And I agree with that. And I would say, absolutely. If you don't have a budget for 30 months, I think it's fair game that every single person in office gets washed out by a wave of dissatisfaction. I think that is absolutely in play. The tactic, however, of saying, I'm not going to pay you, what are the pragmatic ramifications of that? The pragmatic ramifications, what you're really saying is, unless you're independently wealthy and you're able to self-fund and come here on income from somewhere else, you've made a lot of money in your personal life, your family's independently wealthy, et cetera, that you're saying there's no room for John and Jane Q. Public, who live on your street,
to go into public service,
who are wondering how in the world am I going to put my kids through college, and oh my gosh, when the heat bill gets to $400 in the winter, what am I going to do? I think the founding fathers of our nation were very, very clear in the notion that regular citizens should have a place at the table in our democracy. And if you're going to allow one branch of government to literally financially extort another branch of government, that dynamic breaks down rather quickly. And I think, frankly, you really can't have a great conversation about it because the elected, I'm well aware that I am part of the body who hasn't produced a budget or hasn't done this or that or the other. And so I'm not crying a tear over or waiting for anybody in the public to say, woe is that guy. But on the other hand, when you explain to people that if you favor on a fundamental level regular people who do not come from great personal wealth, who live on your street and have your challenges in life and understand your problems, if you want those people and those people who are very much like you serving in the people's house, then you're really not for this tactic. And when you talk to people about it, literally in 2 minutes, most people say, wow, you're right. I hadn't thought of it in that sense. It is important that we don't just have people of independent wealth in our elected positions. And so I think that's a tactic that is outrageous on its face. I think it's a populist thing to do, right? I mean, it's right in the wheelhouse of Governor Quinn. I mean, that's kind of how he's made a career out of that kind of stuff. But it's no more okay with Governor Quinn than it is with Governor Rauner. Now, the bill that needs to happen is that if you employ a tactic of that nature, it's a felony.
I want to have the people kind of understand that basically, I mean, I guess they would all already notice this. The system is broken in so many ways. It's very, very broken. We spend an inordinate amount of time on pointing fingers and talking points and not very much time on governing. One of the things that frustrates me, we went through a litany of bills 3 weeks ago, one bill worse than the next as it relates to the business climate. Not only not improving the business climate, it would have made it way worse. Mm-hmm. And what was that all about? That was about the Speaker appeasing his members, increasingly to the left. The bills would pass with 60 votes, 62 votes. He knew he had a backstop. Governor Rauner would veto it, and it would never become law. One of the things to watch closely... So these are political ploys to say, we voted for this when they go back to their constituencies that want the bill or whatever. And we spend very little time talking about things that are important to my district. I have a district that's on the Indiana border. Indiana has significantly different rules as it relates to the business community. Workman's compensation comes to mind. Illinois has been talking about work comp reform forever. Generally speaking, it's window dressing that doesn't help much. In my community, that's a discussion that could not be more real. The difference for the business owner on my side of the state line versus the other side of the state line is very, very dramatic. I have a friend who was a union iron worker for most of his life.
in the last several years has gone on to the other side. He's now a business owner of a small iron erecting company, and he kind of does the smaller jobs that the big guys don't want to do. And he's made a very nice living out of it, hires union iron workers, etc. He says, well, Chad, he says, when my work comp costs and my built-in cost for work comp on my bid is $57 per 100 for an iron worker, and across the state line it's $15 per 100, who do you think gets the job? Right? Yeah. And so even this person who's a lifetime union iron worker understands, I'm getting killed because you, the legislature, will not seriously address these issues that put us at a spectacular competitive disadvantage. And that's just one issue. And so,
well, we have the property taxes, we have the pension debt. Are we going to pass a budget this year? And then to what extent are we passing budgets that aren't balanced? That's debatable.
I have someone who is very close to me, who is a senior executive of a company whose American headquarters are domiciled in the Milwaukee area. And they are in what would really be described as an agribusiness. They produce a product that is sold to people who make bread and et cetera. So if you make pizza crust or bread, et cetera, these are the customers. And they had a need for a manufacturing facility. My area, right on the state border, great transportation, really robust rail, the natural ingredients that they needed, et cetera. This individual happened to be from my home area, and so he took it to his senior leadership. Why don't we look at these communities? These communities. I even showed him a specific facility, and the senior board laughed. And they said, well, it's a morass there. We can't do that. Now, they had big interests, serious interests in Iowa, Des Moines, other areas. And unfortunately, they decided to not come to our state, despite kind of the inside track, because of the things that you just described. There's too much unknown there. There's not been a real effort to address property taxes. There's not been a real effort to improve the business climate. Our regulatory process, for example, a legendary story from my home area. Honda was going to bring a huge facility, a manufacturing facility for Honda cars. Part of we were in the finals, Vermilion County location, right on the kind of the Vermilion-Champaign County line. One of the things that was difficult for us, this was in the Blagojevich administration, is the administration was painfully absent and tardy with answers to fundamental questions. What do I have to do to get a permit, X, Y, Z? How long will it take, et cetera? We had answers like, well, we don't know. It'll take 2 years, 2.5 years. The governor of Indiana, who is, oh, by the way, flying to Tokyo every other week and meeting with the executives, says, the right answer, which is, when do you need it? Now, he wasn't saying we're going to allow you to pollute our rivers and streams. He was saying, you're so important to us. What can we do to facilitate an experience that's positive so you will hire 500 people, you will spend hundreds of millions of dollars in our community, and the spillover in our community goes way beyond the 500 that we hired. What can we do to make that experience positive for you? Part of it's kind of a mindset and an attitude. And I fear that the combination of the increased polarization in our state and the lack of this proactive attitude that we're open for business, we are in danger of becoming a desert in the middle of the Midwest.
Do you think that we're going to have a budget passed this year? What kind of politics are involved? I have ventured to guess that it didn't seem to me to be in anyone's interest not to pass a budget this year in an election year. But more importantly even than that is we have people that are already leaving the state in droves, giving up on the state, are being taxed out of their house. Businesses for the same thing. When are we going to start addressing these issues? And I guess you don't know, but what needs to change? And is change going to come, or have we still not? It seems to me we're in a crisis state. The house is on fire. And yet, so many people still seem to be playing these games, political games that you've already mentioned. where we're not addressing these issues, and it's crushing the middle class across the state.
I agree. I've a couple of questions there. One is, will we have a budget? I remain hopeful that we will have a budget. I've been told that the climate and the the communication and the climate in those meetings is a positive thing. So I remain very, very hopeful. Certainly, you have to have, it takes two to tango, so to speak, and you have to have the willingness of both parties to have a budget. I mean, the truth of the matter was, the group that I participated in that finally said enough was enough, when the first meeting happened with the speaker personally, the first question was, do you or do you not want a budget? No details asked, do you want a budget or not? Right? Well, that's a pretty fundamental question. It has to be answered the right way, or there's not going to be a budget, right? And the same is true.
And the response was?
Yes. And so it was, well, let's get busy, because this is untenable, and it's an embarrassment, and it's a travesty of democracy. But in the current situation, that question has to be answered yes, both ways. And, the telltale sign, of course, becomes when the heavy-duty finger pointing starts and this guy or that guy or gal is responsible for not having a budget, et cetera, then, you kind of know that the traditional lines of communication have broken down, et cetera. Do I think it's helpful that, I told somebody the heavy lifting happened a year ago. On my side of the aisle, you have a lot of these people who already voted for a budget who have tremendous leverage and are leaving.
I was there covering a conference of Illinois businessmen in Indianapolis about a year ago. And while I was there, the Indiana legislature passed a bill that funded road construction over the next 20 years. And in Illinois, we couldn't get a one-year budget passed.
Right.
I mean, which kind of goes just to show where we are. And I just wonder, what will it take to change this? You have said, and others have said, on both sides of the aisle, that you kind of feel like a man without a party anymore. Are you supporting the governor? Are you even, for re-election? Are you even going to vote for a governor for re-election? When you look at Governor Rauner and J.B. Pritzker, what does that portend in your mind, knowing what you know for the future of the state?
I think that's a dynamic. We will see. One of the things that I think will play out, I would predict there will be more money spent in this governor's election than any in history, certainly in Illinois history, maybe in the history of the United States. I think it will dwarf the amount of money spent in the last presidential election, just because of the wealth of the individuals. I would predict to you that the electorate in total will be screaming uncle and praying for it to be over by Labor Day.
Well, the campaign aside, I'm more
Right.
like, what's the future of Illinois? Should the people, the voters out there, some people are thinking, should I sell my house and get out? Is there reason to have hope for Illinois, or are we in a death spiral?
I think one of the things that I do think is absolutely pivotal is this discussion about how we draw legislative maps, and I kind of talked about it earlier, kind of what the offspring of that has been in terms of polarization and kind of increasingly, these hardened ideologues on each side. If we had a situation where, the notion that any of us, and the notion that the Republicans didn't draw the same kind of maps and wouldn't employ the same tactics if they were in charge, they would, right? And so, if you allow me to stack the deck and you allow me to literally choose in which areas are we going to be successful, and then we'll just concede a few districts and put as many of the other guys in that district as we can, that doesn't bode well for the kind of people that I think you have to have in government who are willing to govern. Look at the people, the organized groups who participated together in that. The League of Women Voters, the Farm Bureau. Now, those are not groups that generally, whose paths would cross, maybe because of subject matter, but when you see groups of that nature, groups that are bringing out
Across the spectrum. And you needed, I think, 400,000 votes, if I remember, and they got 600,000.
Yeah, 630,000.
But then the Supreme Court ruled that...
they did, on a straight party line basis,
reasons.
right? And, my favorite line in terms of a dissenting opinion, actually, too, Justice Bob Thomas, the former kicker for the Bears, had a line that I thought was so strong that his family perhaps one of these days, hopefully many, many years from now, should consider this on his tombstone. He said, the Constitution is, I'm going to make sure I get this right. He said the Constitution is meant to prevent tyranny, not to enshrine it. And what he was saying is, when 630,000 Illinoisans say we want to vote on taking something as fundamental as drawing legislative districts out of the self-interest pockets of current legislators, the notion that I would pick my constituents instead of them picking me is absurd on its face, and it's an end run around the Constitution, and it's really indefensible. And the irony is, in Illinois, the Republicans, of course, would for sure want that because they're in the minority, but nationwide it's the other way around, and I would argue you can't have it both ways. I think there are some very excellent, intelligent people in the General Assembly right now, and I think if left to their own devices, for example, on the current budget, myself and goodwill people on the other side of the aisle could agree on a revenue estimate. If it took over 30 minutes, fire us all, right? Literally, that is the biggest no-brainer of all time. Arguing over nonsense like that is absurd and should be unacceptable to the public. I've been arguing over it for 6 weeks.
But that to me says that no one is learning the lesson. They don't or lesson. The house is on fire. They're still playing political games. The first thing you're going to do, if you're going to put together a budget, is at least say, well, how much do we estimate that we're going to have, right, to work in? That's how big is the box, right? And you're going to say, we're going to have $37 billion of revenue, and then you spend accordingly. Now, maybe the economy improves, and you get $37.5 billion, maybe 38. But at least that's how one would start. I talked to a senator the other day, and he said to me, if it were up to me, I could meet with my colleagues and we'd have a budget in 30 minutes.
Absolutely true. When I first came to Springfield,
so what's holding us back? Why is it the governor? Is it the speaker? I think John Cullerton seems not to have the reputation that let's say the speaker.
Yeah, I think certainly all of the above. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time in the finger pointing. It's this one's fault. It's that one's fault. The larger question is, let me give you an example. I talked to a Democrat in the leadership
in the House,
who told me point blank, I would never, ever have the courage or even the gall to do what you did. And what he was saying is, I would never cross the speaker in that fashion, do what needed to be done, come hell or high water, because I don't have it in me. I would also argue that in terms of the urgency on some of these economic issues, I fear that if you gave an Economics 101 final exam that any student at any community college in the state would take, that if a third of the people in the Illinois General Assembly would pass that, I would take the under on a third. And so,
meaning you don't think they would, huh?
No. And so you have bill after bill after bill after bill coming with great pride about the economics and the business climate of this state, et cetera, being brought forward by folks who don't have very much experience in running or budgeting anything. And that's not to say they shouldn't be in the Illinois General Assembly, but my point is it kind of adds to the frustration that we're spinning our wheels. The ramifications, hey, if you do that, the effect on a business community, that there are already some negative ramifications, get far, far worse. They bring it anyway. And so, but as it relates to the budget, sure. To me, this year's budget is not even difficult. The revenue estimate should be able to be done in 30 minutes, and the rest of it pounded out in short order. Now, are there going to be disagreements until the end of time over the role of government, over what should be the priorities, et cetera? There will be until the end of time. Right. But the math never lies. Right. The math does not lie. You cannot spend
And the other fact is, I mean, you've got Chicago, the pensions, look. Right. You've got the pensions. Let me do this because time's growing short from, I find it interesting, but nonetheless, what time's going sharp. If you were governor today, knowing what you know about the problems the state faces, and you had the power to make change, what would you change to get Illinois back on track?
What I would have done if I was governor personally at the beginning of this governorship, I would have gone to the speaker and I would have said, listen, we have a situation where the spending is out of control, we have huge pension obligations, et cetera, but we also have a situation where we haven't had a capital bill in forever, our infrastructure is failing, et cetera. Sometimes you have to go to what I would say the knowns. The speaker cares a lot about the trades, Local 150, the people building the roads, et cetera. I would have probably gone to the speaker and said, let's do this. Let's have a capital bill right out of the gate. We're going to fix the roads that have got to be the worst in the country. We're going to fix roads and bridges. We're going to put together a package that incentivizes areas to reorganize where necessary for school districts, high schools specifically. It's a huge issue in my area. The problem is nobody trusts that the state will come through with the money. And then you cobble together what is a balanced budget, and everybody declares victory at the end of the first year. That's what I would have done. This is about, at the end of the day, 60 and 30 votes, right? If you don't have the votes,
for those who aren't,
the 60 votes, a simple majority in the House, 60 of the 118.
So to pass a bill or pass a budget, anything, you got to get 60 votes in the House.
And you have to have 30 of the 59 votes in the Senate. If you don't have the 60 or the 30, governing becomes much more of an art form. And the art form includes, the analogy that I give from the minority, and I think this is the reality, the notion that you're going to come in here and you're going to hit a 3-run home run without the votes is highly unlikely to happen. Here's how it works if you're in the minority, in particular if you're in a super minority or near a super minority. You're going to beat out an infield hit, you're going to bunt the guy to second, you're going to steal third, and you're going to score on a wild pitch, and you're going to plant your flag in the ground, and you're going to live to fight another day. And if you don't understand that that's a reality, you need to ask somebody who's been here for 30 seconds, because they will explain to you that it's very close to the reality using a baseball analogy.
And the governor didn't understand that.
Well,
given the strategy that he had by vetoing the budget, and then to me it was like going up to Speaker Madigan. If Speaker Madigan was the hornet's nest, going up with a stick and beating the hornet's nest, you just made an enemy of the speaker by vetoing the entire budget in your first year.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting, again, that anybody check their values at the door or acquiesce entirely to the other side. I'm just saying you have to look at
these things.
You have to look at the reality that's on the table and say, where are areas where we can make progress? On the budget, on paying down pensions, on paying down back debt, as an example.
Let me just get times. Aside from a capital bill, which I think a lot of people on both sides of the aisle would go for, but how do we ever fix? Because we're in a hole now, right? What do we do about pensions? What do we do about property taxes? What business would want to come to Illinois when we have the sluggish bureaucracy that can't get you your permits in time, that you've got higher property taxes, that you've got the overhang of past due bills, that you've got these pensions that are
the good news, the good news is we have natural resources, we have transportation, rail, etc. We have one of the premier urban cities in the entire world. We have the best farmland on planet Earth, I would argue.
And we're centrally located in the country,
etc.
Which other states can't change.
Yeah, we're going to be in play because of a lot of reasons that we really score near the top, right? Some things that you can't be in the middle of the country from Connecticut.
Right.
Never. Or California.
It's why Boeing is now headquartered in Chicago.
Right. And so I think we have a platform from which to jump off of that is and continues to be very, very positive. And so it comes down to this whole sluggish economy. I think a responsible budget, am I predicting this in the next couple of weeks? I don't know that I would go that far. A responsible budget would not only adopt a revenue estimate that is conservative yet reasonable, but it would also build in starting to pay down the backlog of bills, addressing the
Well,
pension
we ought to have a
deficit,
surplus then,
et cetera. Right? And I guess where I'm going is, but we still have a situation, particularly in the majority, respectfully, that every dime that's there plus more wants to be spent and really not do anything about the back bills and the pension, et cetera, as if somebody's going to come in and some magic fairy dust is going to make all that go away. That's a problem. When I was mayor of my own small hometown, when I knew we had large capital expenditures coming up, I would kind of muscle and I didn't have to do much muscling because I had a wonderful city council to work with. We would rat hole money in this year's budget and in next year's budget in anticipation of large capital expenditures, at least the ones that were predictable coming up. If you told somebody here you were going to do that, they would look at you like you were out of your mind. That's exactly how we did business. In my own hometown, we balanced 8 budgets in a row, and when I say balance, I mean really balance, like your checkbook balances. Those things should not be foreign concepts, right? This notion that you can be everything to everybody is not true, and it's never been true, and it's certainly not true in a time of crisis. You have to get back to the fundamentals. And I do think, as citizens, we have to be, and I'm going to be a private citizen again sooner than later, we have to ask much tougher questions than just, are you going to tell me something that I think I want to hear? I want to hear, are you willing to belly up to the bar and make the tough decisions that have to be made? Because if you're coming here to throw stones from the cheap section and just hide behind your ideology, you're not going to be helpful in a situation that is very, very serious.
We could go on longer, but I think that's a good place to stop. Chad Hayes, thanks for your service to Illinois, and good luck on your future.
Thank you
for
so
being with
much.
us.